This case is a little different to my usual content, but it is still just as important. I have watched many true crime documentaries where locals have stated this type of thing doesn't happen here, which would grate my nerves when I'd hear those words. Well, the truth be known, it does happen, and it has happened, and it has been happening for quite some time, and Ireland was only at the very beginning of finding out in 1984. My research has brought me down a minefield of information, opinions, and experts' reports into this case, which explores all aspects of Ireland in the 80s specifically. But it was indeed an intergenerational problem across many eras. So anything here will not be my words, but the words of the people who cared enough about the women of Ireland and the sacrifice they made to change the laws of Ireland and to take away the power the church had over this country, and especially how women and young girls were treated as second-class citizens. St. Thomas Aquinas could sum this up. He decreed that ensoulment took place in a baby boy at 4 weeks, and for a baby girl it was 8 weeks. Today our case brings us back to County Longford and 1984. The first time Ireland found out about this case was when famous broadcaster and TV personality Gay Byrne read out the Sunday newspaper headlines for the next day on his TV show The Late Late Show. It read, "Girl dies giving birth in a field." Obviously, at that moment, the gravity of this did not hit home with old Gabo, as he proceeded to throw the newspaper aside and said, quote, "Nothing terribly exciting there. We now understand as a nation there was a lot there, and it would turn into one of the biggest stories of that era." Anne Rose Lovett was born on the 6th of April 1968 in Cove General Hospital. Cove is a town on the south coast of County Cork. It is situated on an island in Cork City's harbour. It is most famous for the last port of call for the Titanic in 1912, when it made its maiden voyage. Anne was the seventh of her parents' eventual 9 children, 3 girls and 6 boys. Her father, Diarmuid Lovett, was from Kilnalek, a village in the southwest of County Cavan. It is said that he may have been born in County Donegal, but was raised in Kilnalek. Anne's mother, Patricia, was born in Dublin and was said to be a private woman who kept to herself and attended Mass often. Her close friend Lily would say she was a lovely, decent woman, a great parish worker and very religious. Diarmuid had moved the family to Cove for work, but in 1972 he moved his family back to Kilnalek village, where he ran a building firm. In 1981 he moved his family once more to Granard, a nearby small town in County Longford. Here Diarmuid purchased a pub called the Copper Pot. It was situated on the main street. Diarmuid was also a carpenter by trade, but was unemployed and didn't appear to have adjusted successfully to the role of publican. The whole family lived above the pub, but the pub was not a successful venture, but to no fault of the locals. The pub, unfortunately, was rarely open. In 1984, Anne lived at home with her parents and 2 younger siblings, Patricia 14 and Stephen 12. The older children had already moved out, including Anne's only other sister, Louise, who was working in Dublin. Both Anne and Patricia attended Mhuire Secondary School, which was a large mixed school. Anne had done her intercert the summer before and was involved in the school magazine Feach, which is the Irish word for look. Her favourite subjects were art, English and biology. Her friends described her as pixie-faced, with dark brown hair. She was a slight build and not more than 5'2". They would say she was a strong kind of girl, a kick-ass kind of girl. She was pretty. She nearly always had her hair tied up in loads and loads of little plaits. Every so often she would undo the braids and her hair would stick out in all these lovely curls. Anne was very engaging and very, very outgoing, very bubbly and a bit of a tomboy. She was gregarious and the life and soul of all the fun that was happening. They said she was very independent and strong. Anne was fond of hanging out with her friends in Granard's one small pool hall. In reality, this was a little grocery shop with a pool table and 4 Space Invader game machines crammed into it. Anne was also open to anything, letting her friend pierce her ears one day when she called to her house. In the fashion of the 1980s, Anne took to wearing baggy jumpers and big jackets, but she may not have been wearing them to be fashionable, because in January 1984 she was 9 months pregnant at 15 years old. Main Street, Granard, is anchored at one end of Mhuire Secondary School and by St Mary's Church on a small hill at the other end. On Tuesday, the 31st of January 1984, it was a cold, wet and windy morning. Anne rose from her bed, got into her school uniform and left the house to go to school, as she did every morning. She was not the type to miss school. No one in the Lovett household had any idea what the day would bring, but Anne did, as before she left her home she slipped a kitchen scissors into her school bag. Her mother would later say that she saw Anne that morning at around 8 a.m. and she seemed her normal self. Barely a quarter of an hour later, after the weak winter light dawned, a neighbour of the Lovetts was making her way home from early Mass at St Mary's Church. She saw Anne on the street carrying her red school bag and did not notice anything unusual about her behaviour either. But Anne did not go to school that day and apparently was not missed by teachers or classmates. By 1 p.m. Anne had not returned home for lunch. Her parents did wonder why she hadn't, but put it down to her working on the school magazine that she was doing artwork for. Sometime between noon and 12:30 p.m, Anne called to her closest friend Mary, who lived less than a 2-minute walk from Anne's house. 2 days earlier, she had told her friend that she had a pain in her stomach and finally confessed to her that she was pregnant. On that January day, Anne had asked Mary to go with her to a place she did not specify, but she couldn't go with her as she was babysitting. Anne asked her for a cigarette and left. When Anne left the house, she turned right and walked towards the church and its grotto. It was now raining heavily, and whether she realised it or not, Anne was either in or approaching the early stages of labour. The grotto itself was built in the 1930s under the direction of Father Peter O'Farrell, who had been a curate in Longford town and volunteered in the Royal Irish Regiment. The grotto's distinctive railings and water font that remain to this day had come out of the chapel at Granard Workhouse, which closed in 1922 and demolished to make way for the secondary school. Anne approached the grotto and at the entrance dropped her school bag and proceeded inside the railings to the grotto. Here, sometime between 1 p.m. and 4 p.m, she lay down on the floor in the pouring rain, removed her underwear and gave birth to a little baby boy. She cut the umbilical cord with the scissors she had brought with her and wrapped her baby in her coat. It would later be determined that this little baby did not survive the birth, but little Anne was not to know this. Her first instinct was to keep him dry and warm. He was full term and he weighed 6.5 pounds. When it was over and Anne feeling her baby was safe, she lay down once more on the wet mossy gravel, in her school uniform, in the persistent rain, without her coat, her body going into shock and now hemorrhaging. At 4 p.m, 3 schoolboys were walking home from school. Passing the grotto, they spotted the red school bag. They heard moaning coming from the grotto, and as they approached there, they would find poor Anne lying on her back and the dead baby nearby. Her knees and elbows were bruised, dirt lodged underneath her fingernails, surrounded by blood. How terrified Anne must have been, and horrified the boys must have been to come on to such a scene. One of the boys held her hand in his and asked her if she was all right. Anne opened her eyes for a moment and then closed them again. None of the boys stayed with Anne. All 3 ran together to get help. As they ran onto the church street, they came upon a man. They told him there was a girl after falling in the grotto. When the man went into the grotto, he knew straight away what the truth was before his eyes. He too grabbed Anne's hand, which was cold to the touch. This man went straight to the priest's house for help. When the priest opened the door, the man told him what had happened, and the priest told him it's a doctor that is needed. You are needed as well, he said, as the baby is dead and Anne was on the verge of death. Despite the canon saying it was a doctor that was needed, he did not phone one. Instead, the priest went to collect the items he needed to perform the last rites. Meanwhile, the three boys alerted the people in a nearby house, and the man of this house ran across the road to the grotto and immediately returned to ring for the doctor. On hearing the news, the doctor phoned for an ambulance, but it had to come from Mullingar Hospital, which was 42 kilometres away and would take at least 45 minutes to get to the grotto in Granard. The man from the house returned for a second time with blankets. It was still raining heavily and dusk was beginning to fall. By now the priest and the first man had returned to the grotto, and the priest was administering the last rites to Anne and her baby. While this was going on, the three boys went up Main Street and to the Copper Pot pub, where Mr. Lovett and his son were the only ones home at the time, as his wife was out shopping. As soon as they heard the news, the two made their way up to the grotto, arriving at the same time as the doctor. The doctor's medical eye recognised that Anne was suffering from shock, exposure and hemorrhaging. He had some hope for her, but not much. Anne was critically ill. 9 people had now witnessed a scene at the Granard grotto, which none of them were ever likely to forget. The baby and Anne were carried to the doctor's car. He drove them and Anne's father back to the Lovett's house to await the ambulance. Back at the house, Anne's mother had by now arrived home, and out on the streets news was spreading as to what had happened in the grotto. The ambulance finally arrived at 10 minutes past 5, by which point it was dark. Anne was admitted to Mullingar Hospital, and it was noted that her lips and fingertips were white on arrival, a medical state called cyanosis. Blood and oxygen were given to poor Anne, and for a while there were signs that she was recovering, but almost immediately she stopped breathing. Anne was pronounced dead after numerous attempts to revive her. She was aged 15 years, 9 months and 25 days. A little known fact that only came out afterwards: the little baby boy was given a baptism as well as the last rites, and he was named Patrick. A post-mortem was conducted on both baby Patrick and Anne, and they remained in the hospital until the 2nd of February, when they were then removed to St. Mary's Church in Granard. The funeral was held the following morning, with Anne's shocked classmates holding a guard of honour outside the church and then singing in the choir inside. One of her teachers played the violin during the funeral service. Anne was then buried in the local graveyard, both in the one coffin, with her arms wrapped around her little baby boy. Even though what had happened was the talk of the town, it had not reached the newspapers, and therefore Ireland was not aware of this tragic story. A reporter from the newspaper, the Longford Leader, did receive an anonymous call about Anne's death, but it was too late for that edition of the weekly paper, which had already gone to press. The reporter can't prove it, but he felt that the call came from a local Garda in Granard. He also believed when the story didn't appear in that week's newspaper, the caller phoned the newspaper, the Sunday Tribune. This was when Anne's death was featured front page news, and the whole of Ireland would go into uproar and the media would descend on Granard. The first question on everyone's lips was, how could this happen? But this was only the beginning of the questions that would come. Who knew Anne was pregnant? Who was the father? A person who was guilty of statutory rape for having sex with a minor. And where is he? The Lovett family shut their pub and front door and would not open it to anyone, especially reporters. On Tuesday, the 7th of February, Sister Maria Plunkett, principal of Mhuire Secondary School, gave a public statement. It was not made public at the time, but the school had been run by the Sisters of Mercy, which I personally was taught under. It was common knowledge, though, that the nuns had consulted with the solicitor prior to the statement being released. In front of the assembled media, Sister Plunkett sat among her silent staff and read out the following in a shaky voice. It is difficult to express how the staff feel on this sad and tragic occasion. We have gone through the past week with Anne's family and shared their grief and their sense of loss. Anne was an intelligent and bright girl who took an active part in school life and was interested in her studies. She seemed happy in school and gave no indication of being under stress. No one on the staff knew she was pregnant. Had we known about Anne's pregnancy, we would have taken her with understanding and compassion, as would be normal practice. We would have helped her to accept it, to cope with it and also put her in touch with those who would enable her to make the necessary arrangements for the proper care of herself and of her baby. We respect and accept the personality and individuality of each of our pupils. The circumstances of this tragedy reflect an element of mystery on everyone's part. I personally call bullshit. We all know where Anne and her baby would have ended up, just like all the other girls and young women ended up in Ireland at that time. Nell McCafferty, a journalist, and who would go on to be a playwright, a civil rights activist and known feminist, wrote an article for In Dublin magazine at the time. She wrote that one staff member had refused to sit with colleagues that morning while the statement was being read, disgusted at the hypocrisy. The people in the town knew a lot more and the rumour mill went into overdrive. But for outsiders wanting to know what happened, the town of Granard closed ranks. The local reporter from the Longford Leader newspaper knocked on doors and he was told that they didn't know the Lovitts at all. It was an attitude of, please go away and take the story with you. You could tell that the people of Granard were completely at sea as to what was to be done or what was going to happen. They were hit with an absolute avalanche of media coverage. Everyone ran for cover and didn't want to get involved. It was said you couldn't overemphasise the psychological damage this death did to the people of Granard. What they were hit with at the time from the media coverage was the Granard people were at fault, that they were a crowd of barbarians to have let this happen, and that's what really stung and still stings today. But you could see why no one would speak about Anne, because the Catholic Church were everything and then some. They ruled their parishes with an iron fist, and there was no room for error. And if an error occurred, it was not to go outside the perimeter of that village, town and even city. Through a spokesman for Canon Gilfillan, he stated to the media that, quote, whoever gave the news to Dublin was only spreading scandal. He would follow this up in his sermon on Sunday the 12th of February, where he delivered a strong-worded sermon. Quote, the secret of what happened is with that little girl in the grave. What happened should have been left to the town to deal with in its own way. My firm belief is what happened should not have been covered by RTE or the newspapers. It should have been kept parochial, local. They gave us loud-mouthed publicity of the worst kind. But God is good and able to triumph over evil reporting. Oh, give me strength. The same day Sister Plunkett was reading out her statement to the media, a government meeting was held in Dublin about Anne's case. The government received a report from the Minister of Health and Education. This report was not a formally written report. It was in the form of a verbal briefing to Cabinet members about what was known of the case. Sympathy was expressed towards the parents and family, and it was said there would be an inquest. The Midlands Health Board also issued a statement 11 days after the story of Anne became public. It said that Anne had not accessed any of their services, the public health nurse, social workers or community welfare officers. She had, however, attended the local doctor twice in the November before her death. The consultation related to a medical condition, shingles, totally unrelated to pregnancy. The diagnosis arrived and did not necessitate the taking of specimens for an analysis, and the physical examination required was of a type which did not reveal any indication that Anne might be pregnant. Granard Gardaí sent a file on the case to the coroner, which has never been made public, and he in turn has never commented on Anne's case. Rural Ireland was a closed society then on matters relating to the care and protection of children. Had the tragic remains of Patrick been found today, the state would immediately have DNA taken and it would have been preserved for any future inquiry. The inquest into Anne's and baby Patrick's death took place on the 21st of February 1984 at Westmeath County Council building in Mullingar. The public gallery was full. Among those who attended were friends of Anne and one of her teachers. Anne's father, Diarmuid, stated that the family were very close and no one in the family knew she was pregnant. He said that he and his wife were aware that Anne had a boyfriend who was a few years older than her, and they had advised her against seeing him due to the age gap. Anne's mother said there was no trouble at home and never thought she was pregnant. If she had known, she would have made sure that she would have got proper care and assistance. Mary, Anne's friend, then took to the stand and told the inquest that Anne had confided in her that she was pregnant and didn't know what to do about it. Mary wasn't shocked at this news, as Anne had been getting sick fairly often. Mary thought that Anne was going to seek help. The pathologist reported that Anne, in his opinion, had died from shock due to a combination of exposure and blood loss in childbirth, with exposure being the main factor. Little baby Patrick died from asphyxia, probably in delivery, and had been stillborn. The obstetrician who had attended Anne in the hospital stated that she had known 5 certain cases where pregnancy was concealed right up to the time of birth, even from people in the same house and even the same bedroom shared. In summing up, the coroner said it was clear Anne's parents did not know she was pregnant, otherwise they would have sought help for her. He directed the jury to deliver a verdict of death consistent with the pathologist's findings, and with this the inquest was over. An inquiry was called for afterwards, but the government decided that the inquest was enough. So who knew Anne was pregnant? Just about everyone. There were rumours being spread around the town and in school. It was so taboo at that time in the 80s. Not only was having sex outside marriage a sin, but getting pregnant and still in school was a whole other level. A reporter who had relatives in the town of Granard at that time said people trusted him enough to talk to him. It was he who discovered that the baby boy had been baptised with the name Patrick. The shop owner told him that he had known for months that Anne was pregnant, as his daughter had told him. The reporter wrote at that time, quote, "If anyone of Granard stands indicated, it is the scandal givers, the nod and wink moralisers, who knew Anne's plight and cracked jokes about it." He told the Irish Times later in life that local people told him Anne's pregnancy had been known to them, to the extent that some people were joking openly about it prior to her death. So what became of the Lovett family after Anne's death? Her younger sister Patricia, 14, took her own life 3 months after Anne died. Patricia had fallen into a deep depression and would visit her grave and lie beside it. Patricia had held Anne's hand and spoken to her as she was being put into the ambulance, and became consumed by the question as to whether Anne had known she was there with her and had heard her voice. Patricia's friends described her as full of guilt at not having spoken to Anne for much of the previous year, and for not having helped her when she was in pain in the early hours of the morning of the 31st of January, the day Anne died. Anne had woken in pain, and Patricia, sharing a room, did not attend to her. It is thought Anne was at the beginning of her labour. Patricia was buried with Anne and her infant nephew at Granard Kill Cemetery. Diarmuid, Anne's father, passed away in 1987 from a stroke, and her mother Patricia spent the rest of her life living in Granard and passed away in 2015, never speaking about the deaths of her 2 daughters. When her friend did bring up the girls, she'd just say, quote, "Ah, that was a long time back." Louise, Anne's only other sister and who was older, became the chief executive of Longford's Women's Link, a social enterprise which supports women in Longford to overcome various barriers to equality, including the provision of support for survivors of domestic violence. She also served on the board of the National Women's Council of Ireland. So who was the father of Anne's son? This has never been established to this day, but Anne did have a boyfriend up to the previous summer in 1983. He opened up to the journalist Rosita Boland of the Irish Times in 2018. Ricky MacDonald had first met Anne when she was 13 and he was 15. He and his friend called into the Copperpot pub to have a couple of drinks before heading out to do a bit of lamping that night. Anne was helping her father behind the bar, and his first sighting of Anne left him bowled over. He thought she was funny, she was nice looking and friendly. He would say, "I think she liked me," immediately as well. It was like love at first sight. By the time he had left the pub that night, he and Anne arranged to meet later that week. Back in the 80s, there were few places to hang out, but what was there, the local teenagers made the most of it. Soon their friendship deepened, and Ricky described Anne's character as always messing about, always having the crack. She was very sharp, very witty, She could hold her own and was well able to stand up for herself. About what she thought, she was able to back it up. She was brilliant at drawing and intelligent, but kind and caring also. Ricky had returned on his own to Ireland at the age of 15. His mother meanwhile stayed in England after nursing her ex-husband until his death. After his death, she decided to stay on in England, but Ricky wasn't having any of it. His mother did not want him to leave, but Ricky took no heed. At first, he couch-surfed as his mother refused to give him the key to the house that she was renting in Granard. But eventually she gave in and sent him the key to the house, and he moved in alone. Ricky got work helping out the locals in order to look after himself. He would say that Anne often stayed at his place until late, and was surprised by this, that no one ever came looking for her, and she never got into trouble at home for staying out late. Shortly after Anne's 14th birthday, Ricky and her began a sexual relationship. After this, their relationship became more intense, and Anne would stay more often and not go home some nights. They never used contraception, and it did worry them, but it wasn't available back then. They told each other many times that they loved each other and discussed what would happen if Anne became pregnant. She always had the same answer, that she would go to a close family member in Dublin and ask for help. 2 weeks after Anne's 15th birthday, Ricky was at home in bed listening to Radio Luxembourg. At around 10 p.m. he heard banging on the door. It was Anne. She was in a state from crying and told him that she had been beaten. Ricky brought her upstairs, still in her school uniform. He noticed bruises on her thighs. He asked her had she been raped. She did not reply. She just cried and begged Ricky not to tell anyone, not to say anything, not to breathe a word. She was very distressed. After that night, things began to change between Anne and Ricky. They did not meet as much anymore and drifted apart. They never formally broke up, and Ricky really thought they would get back together. The first Ricky heard about the pregnancy was through a friend, and in turn he asked Anne was it true. She denied it. He told her several times over the next few months that if she was, he'd stand by her. Ricky was later asked, given that it was possible he was the father, was he surprised Anne did not tell him she was pregnant? His reply was it baffled him then, and it still baffles him to this day. He and baby Patrick have never been tested to see if their DNA matched, or if it matched to anyone else. The courts and the family would never grant this permission to exhume the body of Patrick, as it is not deemed a criminal case. But if you were to see it as a morally criminal case, then this should have been done years ago. Rosita Boland published an article in March 2018, near the time Anne would have been turning 50. In it, other revelations would come to light about what exactly went on back then, after Anne's death. Anne's friend Belinda was interviewed for the article. She recounted finding a letter amongst Anne's belongings that stated, "If I'm not dead by the 31st of January, I'm going to kill myself anyway." A second letter addressed to Ricky was also found amongst her possessions, in which he says she stated her intention to kill herself and apologised for the hurt this would cause. According to Ricky, he was visited by a local curate, Father John Quinn, who demanded to read the letter and then instructed Ricky to burn it, stating it'll destroy the town. Father Quinn subsequently took him to see Colm O'Reilly, the bishop, who wanted to know exactly what Ricky had told the police about his relationship with Anne, then swore him to a vow of silence. Father Quinn then took Ricky on a short driving holiday around Ulster to get him away from the town and the media, and offered him work and a room in his house. Bishop O'Reilly would go on to deny ever meeting Ricky, while Father Quinn denies having seen the letter from Anne or taking Ricky to see the bishop, but he did confirm the driving holiday. After Anne's sister's death, Ricky left Granard and enlisted in the Defence Forces, then later moved to England. He struggled with alcohol addiction and mental health problems, which he attributed to his experiences in Granard. Belinda and her sister Caroline, who had been close to Anne and Patricia Lovett, shared with Rosita Boland a collection of letters and cards received from the Lovett sisters, with whom they had a daily correspondence as teenagers. Belinda revealed that in December 1983, Anne confided that her father was violent towards her. showing Belinda red welts on her legs that she said were from a beating with a lead pipe. And when asked about telling her mother, Anne replied there was no point. Anne's death sparked a national outcry, highlighting the treatment of teenage and unmarried mothers, as well as legal restrictions on contraception, which would only become available to all adults in 1985, having previously required a prescription and only married couples could access it. The failings of the state in the provision of sex education, which was largely considered a matter for parents only. Anne's pregnancy occurred during the divisive campaign on the referendum for the Eighth Amendment and its aftermath, which enshrined an equal right to life for the unborn in the Constitution, held in September 1983 and passed by two-thirds a majority. This was repealed in the 2018 referendum. Shortly after Anne's death, on the 14th of April 1984, the body of a murdered newborn baby was found on a beach near Catersaveen in County Kerry. The discovery sparked the infamous Kerry babies investigation, in which Gardaí were found to have bullied false confessions from, then fabricated an elaborate story against Joanne Hayes, a single woman from Abbeydorney, and members of her family. Anne's death and the Kerry babies case are counted among the pivotal events of the 1980s and 1990s that led to Catholic Ireland becoming a more secular and liberal state. Both were evoked again during the campaign to repeal the Eighth Amendment, which began in 2012, following the death by medical misadventure of Savita Halappanavar at University Hospital Galway, and concluded with the removal of the amendment from the Constitution in 2018. On the 21st of October 2012, Savita, then 17 weeks pregnant, was examined at University Hospital Galway after complaining of back pain, but was soon discharged without a diagnosis. She returned to the hospital later that day, this time complaining of lower pressure, a sensation she described as feeling something coming down, and a subsequent examination found that the gestational sac was protruding from her body. She was admitted to hospital as it was determined that a miscarriage was unavoidable, and several hours later, just after midnight on the 22nd of October, her water broke, but did not expel the fetus. The following day, on the 23rd of October, Savita discussed abortion with her consulting physician, but her request was promptly refused, as Irish law at that time forbade abortion if a fetal heartbeat was still present, with her midwife furthermore stating that Ireland is a Catholic country. Afterwards, Savita developed sepsis and, despite doctors' efforts to treat her, had a cardiac arrest at 1:09 a.m. on the 28th of October and died, aged 31. On the 23rd of February 1984, 2 days after the inquest into Anne's death, the Gay Byrne radio show dedicated its full programme to reading letters it had received from women telling their stories of teenage pregnancy, being forced to give up their children for adoption and then being rejected and shamed for their sins. Nell McCafferty wrote a bitterly ironic piece for In Dublin magazine, in which she criticised the Catholic Church's ideology and resistance to state intervention in family matters, including its stringent objections to free healthcare provisions for mothers, welfare provisions for deserted wives, and more. McCafferty also highlighted how this had given cover for both state and society to turn a blind eye to the suffering of girls like Anne Lovett. So long as the family kept silent, the community honoured the unwritten code of non-interference with the basic unity of society. Anne has been memorialised by various writers and artists. Christy Moore wrote his song for Anne Lovett in 1989, which opens with the line, "Everybody knew, nobody said." In 2022, Anne, a feature film written and directed by Kieran Craig, was released, telling the story of Anne's final hours. The hundreds of letters sent into the Gay Byrne show on RTE Radio in response to the tragedy in 1984 contained the previously untold stories of many women in Ireland at the time. As Gay Byrne put it then, time and time again they make the point that being able to write it all down is a relief. They thank Anne Lovett for giving them the courage to express what they had kept secret. Her sacrifice was not in vain, is their point. This programme was a devastating piece of broadcasting, which gave voice to women who had until then suffered in silence. It also revealed the different perspectives of a nation: anger, shame, sorrow, and indignant, as it grappled with the deaths of a teenager and her baby. Extracts from some of these letters were published, many of which were identified only by their place of origin, and so here they are. Wexford, I know how Anne felt, as I have travelled down that same lonely road. At the age of 16, I found myself pregnant and still at school. I concealed my pregnancy until I was 8 months pregnant. My mother then discovered with great horror that her only daughter was one of these unmentionable people. How could I humiliate them this way? What would the neighbours think? My parents were very well-off business people. It was decided that I would go and look after my poor old sick great-aunt in Dublin. After 6 weeks, I gave birth to a baby boy and returned home immediately to pick up from before, as if nothing had ever happened. Never in the past 10 years since the birth of my baby have my parents ever talked about my pregnancy. They even talk about other girls who get into trouble, as if I never had a baby. Of course my baby was adopted. There was never any question of anything else happening. I hid my secret with great hurt and guilt. I feel very depressed at times, and I wish I could reveal my long-kept secret to somebody. On several occasions I've walked into my local GP's waiting room in the hope of talking to him, but always failed to wait and see him for fear of what he might think of me. Carlo. In 1972 I found myself expecting. I was 16. I was expelled and disgraced from the Mercy Convent in Carlow town. A priest who visited me told me I would pay for my great sin for the rest of my life. My baby, a boy, was taken from me. I am not allowed to trace him. My own mother died before the child was born. She never went outside the door after news of my downfall became public. I accepted all this as part of my punishment, but I am still paying. I cannot relate all the things that happened in my life without breaking down. My point is that I lived after my sin, and I've been treated as an outcast ever since. All this sorrow would be turned into gossip had Anne lived. Why was there this fear in 1984, meaning that Anne could tell no one? When the people of Granard pray before their grotto, pray for us who live to pay. Kilmallock, Limerick. In about 1940, Mary was an agricultural servant girl, employed by a farmer in this area. Mary worked about 12 or 13 hours a day, beginning at 6 a.m. She became pregnant like so many of these poor agricultural slaves. Mary's lover was a married man from the nearby village, the father of 9 children. She was 28 years of age, a beautiful singer, and always in good humour. Mary was able to hide her pregnancy until about the 7th month, when one day the farmer's wife, who was also pregnant, confronted her. Mary denied everything and said her body gathered fluid sometimes and it disappeared again. Mary's employer didn't really believe this, but a blind eye was turned to the situation. Mary continued with her work. A day or two before Good Friday in that year, it was potato setting day. Mary rushed into the house just before dinner to give the final help, serving up the meal for all the others. She had none herself, as she said she had a headache. She then cleaned and washed up after the meal and asked for an hour or 2 off to go to bed with the blinding headache. Mary got the permission, and after about an hour her employer called to her bedroom door, which was locked. Mary assured her that she was much better and would be up shortly. After about another hour, the house was filled with the screams of a new baby. The employer went to the garden for her husband. He set off to Mary's house a few miles away and brought back her elderly father. Mary still had the door locked, and after they forced it open, she denied everything. They searched the room and found a little baby boy choked by a stocking and packed with her clothes in her case. The father walked his daughter home and carried the case. Later that night, the baby was buried in the nearby graveyard. Mary returned to her work after 2 days. She got no sympathy or concession. After 2 or 3 weeks, she had to visit a doctor. She was sent to hospital for treatment. Her breasts were almost rotted. the doctor said. She again returned to her job on her discharge from hospital. Her distress, her broken heart were all hidden. She got no help or care. It didn't exist then. Ennis. Teenagers all over Ireland should be on their knees praying to what I believe is their new martyr, Anne Lovett. Let there be no doubt but that she died in the arms of Mary to save all other girls from ending their lives like her. Her pain surely was her purgatory here on earth, and she and her baby are enjoying a special place in heaven. I really believe it was meant to happen to save this generation. On having several conversations here in schools, there has not been a home in Ireland on Sunday night that parents were not sitting down talking to their children, hoping to make them understand that they should feel able to tell their parents if they have a problem. Dublin. During Anne Lovett's pregnancy, what were we doing in this country? We were going quite hysterical over pro-life amendments. We were refusing to allow another teenage mother permission to return to school to complete her education. We were sacking another woman from her teaching job because she had a baby by a married, separated, deserted, in fact, man. Now that is quite a dismal scene to any prospective single mother, but especially to a 14 or 15-year-old schoolgirl. Babies are great and welcome in Ireland as long as they have a mammy and daddy who are married and respectable. Our pro-life, pro-baby ideas vanish outside of this neat, church-approved setup. They have been Anne Lovett's in the past and will be more in the future because we are dishonest and hypocritical. Cork. I was working during my school holidays. I was 15 and pregnant. No one knew at the time and I was able to hide it. I lived in a small town and the people didn't worry me. It was my parents. Please don't get me wrong about my parents. They were and are the dearest and best parents anyone could hope for. But my main worry was, would I shame them? What would they think of me? Would it kill them? I got off from work when I went into labour. I walked around wondering what I was going to do. I was going to jump into the river. I kept praying to myself and I decided to go home. I went to bed telling my mother I had a sore throat. I went through 8 hours of strong labour and I had the baby. Thank God, no complications. My mother came into the room to check on me and you can imagine her shock. She rushed for the doctor and everything turned out fine. I remember my father saying, "Don't worry, you can keep your son. I fed 9 of you, 1 more won't make any difference." My son is 11 now and my parents are proud of him. He knows I'm not married and he accepts it. No one should blame Anne's parents and they certainly shouldn't blame themselves. It's only someone who goes through it knows the pressure. You just can't bring yourself to tell anyone. My parents were hurt that I couldn't confide in them. I would love for Anne's family to know my story, as I understand why she didn't tell them. She was thinking of them and only them. I am lucky to be alive, to be able to tell you my story, not like poor Anne. Just a few words to all unmarried girls who have had babies. We give life and not take it, which is a good thing. Rest in peace, Anne.